This experiment is one that has to do with boats. And a lot of youngsters love working with anything that has to do with water. So it's a great experiment that you can do with kids of all ages. So I'm going to show you the 3E model. I know it's technically the 5E model, but if we're working with young kids, we can just make it 3 E's. So the first E is for engage. So in this portion of the experiment, you want to ask your students, what shapes do you see on a boat? So you might get all kinds of answers depending on the age of your children, right? Are they round, flat, curvy, square, squiggles, triangles, octagons? What kind of shapes do you see? And then ask them if the shape matters, right? Will the shape play a role in whether or not the boat floats? And that could be a tough question for some kiddos. It just depends on how much experience they have around boats and how much they've been exposed to physics, really. And then ask their students if they could give you some ideas on how they would design a boat. So you might see just some of your typical looking toy boats, right? You might just see students describing stuff like this, but you could see students describing things like barges. You can see all kinds of stuff. So depending on the age of your students, they might tell you all kinds of neat stuff. So in this experiment, what I do in the explore portion is I give the students materials and I let them test it out. So I give my students aluminum foil, and then I give them lots of different shapes. And they can even, if you give them enough notice, they can bring in some shapes from home. So I just give the students aluminum foil, and then I give them some shapes. So this one was made from this cube here, right? So I just pressed it around the cube. This one was made from a little toy cylinder. Okay, so you can give the students the shapes, and then you can throw all kinds of silly stuff in there too. I mean, put a dinosaur on the table and just see what you get there, right? You can throw all kinds of interesting shapes out there. And again, you can have the students bring in their own shapes. So give them the materials and then have them make a boat, right? So you just take your aluminum foil and you wrap it around your shape and it gives you your boat, okay? And you may need to help them with that depending on the age of the children. And then go test it out. So to test it out, you can try it in a lot of different things. You can use an old fish tank. Obviously, you're moving the fish first. If you have one of those little kiddie pools, that'll work. Here at my house, when my kids and I do this experiment, they have a water table. And so we just tested things out in there. So you give them their opportunity to make their boat. Ask them, does it float? Great, it floats. See how much load it can carry. Because, a ship carries stuff around, a barge carries stuff around. What happens when I start adding mass to my boat? Passengers. And so this one's still floating, right? So you can start adding things to your boat and give the students lots of different things to choose from. Change is a good cargo for these kinds of boats, but you can have whatever kind of cargo you want. And then you can also ask your students, can you make it go, right? So could you blow it from one side to the other? Is it difficult to maneuver? If you have a hairdryer handy, you could try to blow it, but obviously you want to keep that hairdryer safely distanced from that water. So that's a good 20-30 minute activity right there, at least, depending on the age of your children. And then let's explain. That's the third E. So you look at your boats and you say, okay, what caused the boat to float or sink, right? Because some of these boats, are going to sink. It just depends on the shape. I'm assuming that a dinosaur boat probably wouldn't be the greatest choice, but you never know. So what caused your boat to float or sink? Was it the shape? Was it the length? Was it because it contained too much cargo? And then when you get into the explanation of the science, you've got some options, because you could if your students are really young, you're not going to get into buoyancy with them. So one of the easiest ways to explain this to the young kiddos is to explain that the mass of the boat needs to be less than the mass of the water that it pushes away. In other words, displaces. So if you're looking at my boat that I just made here, and it's kind of starting to sink, it's not looking so good, right? It's because it's not displacing enough water to offset the mass. Whereas some of these boats are doing just great, right? They're displacing enough water to offset the mass of the boat. So how much detail you get into in explaining the physics of why something floats or sinks, that's completely at your discretion, and it's going to vary based on the age of your children. But if you use the 3E model here, which is engage, explore, and explain, engage, explore, explain, you can walk your students through a very scientific approach to doing something that they're pretty familiar with in their everyday life. And not only that, but it's a lot of fun, and it involves water, so can't really go wrong there. I hope you have lots of fun exploring physics and boats.